The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of late August humidity, diesel fumes, and the quiet desperation of a family losing everything. It was 1976, and the writing was on the wall for anyone who couldn't keep up. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans, not looking to buy much. Maybe a set of old John Deere wheel weights if they went cheap, or a decent anvil for the shop. My business was my own, and my farm, the one my grandfather broke the sod on, was paid for. That was a fact that stuck in some folks' craw. My old Ford F-250, a 68 with more rust than paint, but an engine that purred like a kitten, was parked out on the road. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming new Chevy Silverado that pulled in, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on everyone. The door swung open, and out stepped Richard Blevins. He was 10 years younger than me, with a soft face that had never seen a full day's work in the sun without the protection of an air-conditioned cab. He wore a crisp seed corn cap and a pearl snap shirt that looked like it had been ironed that morning. Blevins wasn't just a farmer, he was an operator. He farmed land, sure, but he also farmed the bank. He was the first in the county to buy a brand new International Harvester, 1496, the one with the deluxe red and white cab, a stereo, and a ride so smooth you could drink a cup of coffee on washboard gravel. He was the poster boy for Earl Butts's gospel. Get big or get out. He strode through the crowd like he owned the place, which, in a way, he was about to. He wasn't here for anvils or wheel weights. He was here for the land. Old man Miller had farmed his 240 acres with a pair of tired Farmall 560s and a Gleaner combine that was more patches than original tin. He'd tried to keep up, took out a loan for a new planter 2 years back, but one bad crop and sky-high interest had put the nail in his coffin. Blevins clapped a few guys on the back, his voice booming over the auctioneer's patter. Sad day, boys, sad day. But that's progress, ain't it? Can't make money turning wrenches on junk. His eyes swept the crowd and landed on me. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He sauntered over, his new boots crunching on the gravel. Silas. Figured I'd see you here, he said, loud enough for a half-dozen other farmers to hear. Picking through the bones, are we? Looking for a spare part for that museum you call a machinery shed? I just nodded, my gaze fixed on the auctioneer. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply. My main tractor was a John Deere 4020, a 69 side console model. It was one of the best tractors Deere ever made, and I'd bought it used 5 years ago, paid cash. I knew every bolt, every gasket, every hydraulic line on that machine. I could tear it down and put it back together in the dark. To Blevins it was an antique. To me, it was freedom. You know, Silas, he continued, leaning in a little, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be overheard. The bank's practically giving money away right now. You could trade in that whole fleet of yours, get yourself a new 1596, maybe one of those new 4-wheel drive Steigers. Farm fence row to fence row. You're leaving money on the table trying to patch up that old iron. My iron is paid for, Richard, I said, my voice low and even. It doesn't owe a dime to any man in a suit. Blevins laughed, a short, sharp bark. You can't eat paid for, Silas. This is a business. You gotta have credit. You gotta have leverage. You're still thinking like your granddaddy. It's a new world. The auctioneer moved on to the real estate. The crowd grew quiet. Blevins straightened up, puffing out his chest. His bid came out strong and clear, silencing the few tentative offers from smaller neighbors. He bought all 240 acres without breaking a sweat, signing the papers with a flourish right there on the hood of the banker's car. As he walked back to his truck, he caught my eye again, and gave me a little wink, as if to say, "That's how it's done." I watched him drive off, his new truck leaving my old Ford in a cloud of righteous dust. The other farmers, men I'd known my whole life, shifted their feet and avoided my gaze. They saw Blevins as the future. They saw me as a stubborn fool, a relic clinging to the past, too cheap or too scared to take a chance. They saw my calloused, grease-stained hands and his clean fingernails, and they made their choice about who the smart one was. I didn't buy a thing that day. I just got in my old truck, turned the key, and listened to the familiar, reliable rumble of the 390 V8 that I owned outright. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Blevins and I weren't just farming different fields. We were living in different worlds, and I wondered how long my world could hold out against his. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you all a question, and I want you to be honest down in the comments. Have you ever known a man like Silas, who believed in owning his tools and his land free and clear, no matter how old they were? Or are you more on the side of Blevins, believing that you have to spend money to make money, and that debt is just another tool in the toolbox? Let me know what you think, because the answer to that question is at the very heart of what happened next in our county. The fall of '76 was a good one. The corn stood tall and the beans were heavy in the pod. The weather held clear and dry, perfect for harvest. My John Deere 7700 combine, a machine I'd bought at an auction 10 years prior, was chugging along nicely. It wasn't fast, it wasn't fancy, and it sure as heck didn't have an air-conditioned cab. The dust and chaff filled the air, sticking to the sweat on my face and arms, but the sound of the grain filling the hopper was music. I was making good time on the 80 acres of corn I had along the creek bottom. Then it happened. There was no warning, just a sudden, violent shudder that shook the whole machine, followed by a sickening, grinding sound and a loud bang that echoed across the field. The header stopped dead. The cylinder whined down to silence. I killed the big diesel engine, and the sudden quiet was more alarming than the noise had been. I sat there for a moment, the silence ringing in my ears, the smell of hot metal and dust filling my nose. I knew, with the certainty of a man who knows his machines intimately, that this was bad. I climbed down and slid underneath, the warm dirt still holding the day's heat. A quick look confirmed my fears. The main drive shaft, the thick piece of hardened steel that transferred power from the engine to the entire threshing mechanism, had sheared clean in two, right at the universal joint. It was a catastrophic failure. The broken end had flailed around, chewing up the shield and putting a nasty dent in the main frame before everything seized up. My heart sank. This wasn't a simple belt or a clogged filter. This was major surgery. The John Deere dealer in town was a good 2-hour drive away, and even if they had the part in stock, which was a long shot for a combine this old, it would be 2 days before they could get it to me. Then there was the cost. A new drive shaft assembly for a 7700 would likely run close to $1,000, maybe more. That was money I didn't have to spare. More importantly, I didn't have the time. The forecast was calling for a big storm system, moving in from the west in 3 days. 3 days. If I didn't get this corn out of the field, I'd be looking at a total loss. There was only one thing to do: fix it myself. I spent the rest of the afternoon under that machine, wrestling with the broken shaft. The bolts were rusted solid, fused by years of heat and dirt. I soaked them in penetrating oil, hammered on the wrenches with a 3-pound sledge, and cursed until I was hoarse. My knuckles were bloody, and my back screamed in protest. But finally, Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last bolt gave way, and the heavy, mangled piece of steel fell into my arms. I hauled it back to the shop, a long, low building my grandfather had built from salvaged telephone poles and corrugated tin. It wasn't much to look at, but inside was my sanctuary. A heavy-duty vise, a Lincoln arc welder, a drill press, and decades of accumulated tools, parts, and scrap iron. This was where my philosophy paid off. While Blevins was signing loan papers, I was at auctions, buying old tools for pennies on the dollar. I clamped the broken shaft in the vise and examined the damage. The break was jagged, crystalline, metal fatigue, no way to weld it back together and expect it to hold. The U-joint was destroyed, the yoke was twisted. I needed a new shaft, plain and simple. The next morning, I was on the phone before the sun was up, calling every salvage yard within 100-mile radius. Nobody had a drive shaft for a 700. It was too old. Just as I was about to give up, a grizzled old fella down in Macon County had an idea. "Don't have one for a 7700, he grumbled through the phone, but I got a main shaft out of an old Massey Ferguson 510 that got scrapped. Might be the same length. U-joint's probably different, but the shaft itself is good steel." It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I told him I was on my way. I threw the broken shaft in the back of my Ford and drove the 60 miles, pushing the old truck harder than I normally would. The salvage yard was a graveyard of forgotten iron, rows upon rows of rusting combines, and tractors sitting silent in the weeds. The old man led me to the Massey shaft. It was caked in grease and dirt, but a quick measurement showed it was, by some miracle, the right length. The diameter was the same. The splines on the end, however, were completely different. I bought it for $50. Back in my shop, the real work began. I had to cut the yoke off my old John Deere shaft and the yoke off the Massey shaft, then weld the Deere yoke onto the Massey shaft. It had to be perfectly straight, perfectly balanced. If it was off by even a fraction of an inch, the vibration would tear the combine apart. I spent hours with a grinder, carefully preparing the two pieces of metal, beveling the edges for a strong weld. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and burning steel as I laid the first bead with the arc welder. The bright blue light so intense I had to shield my eyes even through the dark lens of my helmet. I laid bead after bead, building up the weld, letting it cool slowly to prevent it from becoming brittle. I flipped it, ground the other side, and welded it again. It was slow, tedious work. My hands were steady, my focus absolute. In the middle of the afternoon, as I was grinding the weld smooth, I heard a vehicle slow down on the road. I glanced up and saw Blevins's new Silverado idling there. He was sitting in his air-conditioned cab, looking out at me. My shop doors were wide open to catch the breeze, and he had a clear view of the whole operation. Me, covered in sweat and grinding dust, working on a greasy piece of junk on my shop floor. He just sat there for a minute, a smug look on his face, then shook his head slowly and drove off. He didn't even have the decency to stop and offer a condescending word. The silent judgment was worse. Later that evening, my wife, Martha, brought me out a thermos of coffee and a plate of sandwiches. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face etched with worry. "How's it going, Silas?" she asked, her voice soft. "It's going," I said, not looking up from my work. "It has to." "The men were talking at the co-op today," she said quietly. "Richard Blevins was there. He told everyone your combine was broke down for good. Said you were trying to weld the drive shaft back together like some backwoods mechanic. They were laughing. I stopped the grinder. The high-pitched whine died, leaving a ringing in my ears. I looked at her, at the worry in her eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt entered my mind. Was I just being stubborn? Was Blevins right? Was I a fool, trying to hold back the tide with nothing but my own 2 hands? I looked down at the shaft. The weld was ugly, but it was strong. I looked around my shop, at the tools I owned, at the building that stood on land that was mine. No banker could take this away from me. Let them laugh, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I picked up the grinder again. I've got work to do. I worked through the night under the bare bulb of a single work light. I finished the grinding, fitted the new U-joint I'd picked up at the parts store, and painted the shaft with a coat of John Deere green, more for pride than anything else. By dawn, it was done. It was a hybrid, a mutt, a piece of machinery born of desperation and stubbornness, part John Deere, part Massey Ferguson, all Silas. Getting it back into the combine was an even bigger nightmare than getting it out. I lay on my back, wrestling the heavy shaft into place, my muscles screaming with exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last bolt was tight. I climbed into the operator's seat, my body aching, my hands raw. I took a deep breath and turned the key. The big diesel roared to life. I let it warm up for a minute, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly, gently engaged the separator. There was a clunk, a groan, and then a smooth, powerful hum. No vibration, no grinding, just the familiar, beautiful sound of a machine ready to work. I pushed the throttle forward, and the whole combine sang. I pulled out of the shop and drove straight back to the field. The sky to the west was turning a bruised purple. The storm was coming. I didn't stop, not for food, not for rest. I ran that combine for 18 straight hours, the headlights cutting a swathe through the darkness, until the last row of corn was harvested and the grain bin was full. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, I drove the combine back to the shed, the engine humming a song of victory. I had lost a day and a half of time, but I hadn't lost the crop, and I had done it my way. The next couple of years were good ones. 1977 and 78 saw grain prices climb to levels nobody had ever seen before. The talk at the coffee shop was all about expansion, about opportunity. Land that had sold for $500 an acre 5 years ago was now fetching $2,000, and it was still going up. The banks, flush with cash, were loaning money to anyone with a decent credit history and a patch of dirt to call their own. It was a gold rush, and Richard Blevins was leading the charge. He bought another 320 acres from a retiring farmer, paying top dollar. He didn't blink. "They ain't making any more of it," he'd boom to anyone who would listen, quoting a line he'd read in a farm magazine. To work the new ground, he traded in his nearly new 486 for a brand new International Harvester, 1586, and then went out and bought a massive, articulating Steiger Panther, one of those big green 4-wheel drive monsters that could pull a 12-bottom plow through clay like it was sand. His line of credit at the Farmers' Trust and Savings grew with every purchase. He was the local celebrity, the man the bankers took to lunch, the one whose picture was in the county paper, standing proudly in front of his gleaming new equipment. He was the very picture of success. Meanwhile, I just kept on farming my same 400 acres. The profits from those good years were tempting. I could have easily used them as a down payment on another quarter section. Martha and I talked about it over the kitchen table late at night. The numbers looked good on paper. But something held me back. I remembered the look on old man Miller's face at his auction. I remembered the feel of desperation in the air. Instead of buying more land, I paid off the last of the mortgage on the original homestead. The day I walked out of the bank with the deed in my hand, free and clear, was one of the proudest days of my life. The banker, a young fella named Thompson, who was Blevins's best friend, just shook his head. "Silas," he said, trying to sound helpful, "you're sitting on a gold mine here. With your equity, you could borrow enough to double your operation. You're being too conservative." "I sleep pretty good at night, Mr. Thompson," was all I said. I used the rest of the money to shore up what I already had. I pulled the engine on my 4020 and did a complete in-frame overhaul myself. New sleeves, pistons, rings, the works. I spent a week in the shop, covered in grease. But when I was done, that tractor ran better than it had the day it rolled off the line in Waterloo. I put a new steel roof on the main barn, replacing the old shingles that had been leaking for years. I bought a used heavy-duty lathe for the shop, something I'd wanted for a decade, knowing it would let me make my own bushings and repair parts. To everyone else, it looked like I was falling behind. Blevins would drive by my place, his new rig kicking up dust, and I'd be out there on a ladder, nailing down tin roofing like some handyman. The talk at the co-op was that Silas was too scared to play the game, too cheap to invest in his own future. He was polishing the brass on the Titanic, they said. The world was passing him by, and he was too stubborn to see it. One evening, I was at the parts store, picking up some hydraulic fluid, when Blevins came in. He was in a fine mood, bragging about the deal he'd just closed on another 80 acres. "You hear that, Silas?" he said, slapping me on the back. "Gotta keep growing. Inflation's running 10%. If your net worth isn't growing faster than that, you're going backwards. It's simple economics." "My net worth is my own, Richard," I said quietly. "It's not co-signed by that fella Thompson down at the bank." He just laughed. "You're a dinosaur, Silas. A damn dinosaur. You'll see. This thing is going to the moon." I finished my business and walked out into the cool evening air. I wasn't so sure. I'd been listening to the radio. Not the music stations, but the farm report and the national news. Whispers from Washington about a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve. Talk about tightening the money supply to fight inflation. Words like prime rate and variable interest loans started popping up more and more. I'd seen the fine print on the loan papers at the bank when I paid off my mortgage. I saw the clause that said the interest rate wasn't fixed. It could float. It could change with the market. That night, I sat in my quiet, paid-for shop, the familiar smells of oil and steel a comfort to me. I was sharpening the shares for my old moldboard plough, the rhythmic scrape of the file on the metal a soothing sound. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the tin on the new roof. It sounded different than it used to. It was a colder wind with a sharper edge to it, and it carried the scent of a distant, gathering storm. Blevins and the others, they couldn't feel it yet. They were too busy celebrating in the sunshine. But I could feel it. I could feel the pressure changing, and I knew, deep in my bones, that the good times weren't going to last forever. The turn came in the summer of 1980. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper of heat. The sky, which should have been a hazy, humid blue, bleached to a stark, white glare. The rains of June tapered off in early July and then stopped altogether. The corn, which had been racing toward the sky, began to slow. By the last week of the month, the broad green leaves started to curl in on themselves during the heat of the day, a thirsty plant's last defense against the sun. They called it a flash drought. The ground, baked hard as brick, cracked open in jagged lines that ran through the bean fields like dark veins. My old 40s-20 didn't seem to mind the heat. Its simple, gear-driven design and oversized radiator were made for hard work. I'd set the timing on the Rusa Master injection pump myself that spring, and the big 6-cylinder diesel just sipped fuel as I cultivated the beans one last time, trying to conserve every drop of moisture. The cab was an oven, the air thick with the smell of hot oil and dry dirt, but the tractor never missed a beat. One afternoon, I was coming in from the field when I saw Blevins's massive Steiger Panther sitting dead in the middle of his biggest field, the one he'd bought from the Miller estate. The big 24-foot field cultivator was lifted halfway out of the ground, frozen in place. That machine was his pride and joy, a symbol of his dominance. Seeing it silent and helpless under that blistering sun was like watching a giant fall to its knees. I pulled my truck over and walked out to him. He was on the ground, staring at a complex block of hydraulic valves, his face streaked with grease and frustration. His fancy pearl snap shirt was soaked with sweat and stained with hydraulic fluid. "Trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He kicked one of the huge tires, a gesture of pure, childish anger. "Damn thing won't move," he spat. "Transmission's locked up. Some kind of electronic solenoid failed in the hydraulic control module. The dealer says they've never seen one do this. They've got to order the whole module from the factory in Fargo. Could be a week." "A week?" He waved his arm at the half-cultivated field. "I've got to get this ground worked and kill these weeds before they suck the last drop of water out of the soil. A week from now, it'll be too late. This corn will be toast." I looked at the valve block. It was a maze of hoses, wires, and sensors, nothing like the simple direct levers on my 4020. There was nothing to hit with a hammer, nothing to pry with a bar. It was a black box, and the magic inside had died. "The part," he said, his voice dropping, "is $2,400, plus 2 days of labor for their mechanic to drive out here and install it. Can you believe that? $2,400 for a part the size of a shoebox." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. I was thinking of the $50 I paid for that Massey drive shaft. He finally got the part 10 days later. By then, the damage was done. His yields that fall were a disaster, down by a third. My corn, which I'd cultivated at just the right time, held on. It wasn't a bumper crop, but it was enough. The real blow, however, came not from the sky, but from the evening news. The president had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, one of the biggest markets for American corn vanished overnight. The price at the local elevator, which had been over $3 a bushel, dropped to $2.50, then $2.20, and showed no sign of stopping. The chatter at the coffee shop turned grim. The easy talk of expansion and record profits was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about cash flow and operating notes. Blevins was the loudest voice, but his tone had changed. The booming confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle anger. He blamed the president, the Arabs, the weather, everyone but himself. He'd bought all his fertilizer and seed for the next year back in the fall, paying top dollar on credit, betting the price would go up. Now he was stuck. The first real cracks were showing in his empire, and the foundation, I was beginning to realize, was nothing but a mountain of paper held at the farmer's trust and savings. The winter of 1981 was cold and bleak, and it felt like the chill had settled deep into the bones of the county. The man from the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, had declared war on inflation, and the only weapon he had was to jack up interest rates. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything else, climbed past 15%, then 18%, then clawed its way over 20%. It was a number that was simply unimaginable to us. For me, it was just a headline on the news. I had no operating loan. My farm was paid for. My machinery was mine. The only bills I had were for fuel, seed, and my property taxes. It would be a tight year, no doubt, but I would survive. For Richard Blevins and dozens like him, that number was a death sentence. His loans weren't fixed. They were variable rate, tied directly to the prime. The interest payments on his hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt tripled almost overnight. It was like watching a man try to run up a mudslide. The harder he struggled, the faster he sank. He sold off a herd of cattle he'd bought as an investment, taking a huge loss. It wasn't enough. He tried to get a second mortgage on his land, but the unthinkable was happening. Land values were collapsing. The same acre that was worth $2,000 2 years ago was now struggling to fetch $1,000. The banks, which had been so eager to lend, were now terrified. His collateral was evaporating, and his debt was multiplying. The banker, Thompson, stopped taking Blevins out for lunch. Now, when Blevins went to the bank, he had to wait in line like everyone else, his hat in his hands. The friendship, it turned out, was only collateral on the loan. The breaking point came in the spring of '82. Blevins missed a payment, then another. The official-looking letters started arriving in his mailbox. The phone calls became more frequent, more demanding. I saw him at the co-op one morning. He looked like a ghost. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes were hollow, and he'd lost so much weight his clothes seemed to hang off him. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He bought a single bag of seed corn, paying with a crumpled $20 bill. He couldn't get credit anymore. He saw me looking at him, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the old arrogance. "What are you looking at, old man?" he snarled. "Enjoying the show?" "There's no show here, Richard," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Just a bad time." He just shook his head and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The auction was set for a Saturday in early June. The sale bill in the county paper was a full page long. It listed it all: 1,200 acres of prime bottomland, a nearly new IH 1586 tractor with only 800 hours, a Steiger Panther 4-wheel drive, a 6-row IH cycloplanter, a Gleaner N6 combine with both heads. It was a breathtaking list, the dream inventory of any farmer in the state, and it was all being sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. It was the biggest foreclosure sale the county had ever seen. The day of the auction was grey and overcast, the sky the colour of lead. It felt appropriate. The crowd was even bigger than the one at the Miller sale 6 years earlier, but the mood was funereal. Farmers stood in tight, quiet knots, their faces grim. They weren't here out of spite. They were here out of fear. They were here to see what could happen to the biggest, most successful operator in the county, and to wonder if they were next. I saw Blevins standing off to the side with his wife and 2 young kids, near the banker's car. He wasn't wearing a crisp seed corn cap or a pearl snap shirt. He was wearing a plain, faded work shirt and looked like a stranger at his own funeral. His wife was crying silently, her arm wrapped around his. The auctioneer started with the equipment. The big Steiger, which Blevins had paid over $100,000 for, sold for $40,000. The 1586 went for less than half of what he'd paid. Piece by piece, his empire was dismantled for pennies on the dollar. The crowd was silent, the bids coming in low and hesitant. No one was taking any pleasure in this. Then came the land. It was sold off in parcels. The 240 acres he'd bought from the Millers, the 320 he'd bought from the retiring farmer. Each parcel went for a fraction of what he'd paid, swallowed up by a syndicate of out-of-state investors the bank had brought in. Finally, The auctioneer came to the last parcel. All right, folks, next up is the Home 80, the original Blevins family homestead. A good house, a solid barn, and some of the best soil in this county. My heart clenched. This wasn't just another piece of collateral. This was his home, the place where he'd grown up, where his father had farmed before him. To lose that was to lose your roots, your history, your very identity. The bidding started low. The investors weren't interested in a small parcel with a house on it. A few neighbors made tentative bids, but they were stretched thin themselves. The bidding stalled at a price that was criminally low. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but there was no money and no spirit. "Going once," he called out. "Going twice." I looked over at Blevins. His head was bowed, his shoulders shaking. He was a broken man. The smug, arrogant operator was gone, replaced by a father who was about to lose his home. And in that moment, I felt no vindication, no triumph. All I felt was a profound and terrible sadness. This wasn't a game. This wasn't about who was right and who was wrong. This was about a family, a community, being torn apart by forces none of us truly understood. I had come to the auction with the deed to my farm in the lockbox at home, and a healthy balance in my savings account at a different bank in the next county. I hadn't come to buy. I had just come to watch the end of an era, but looking at Blevins and his young family, I knew I couldn't just stand by and watch them be swept away. I raised my hand. My voice, when it came out, was clear and steady. It cut through the silence. "I'll bid 1,000 an acre." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a fair price, maybe even a little generous in the current market, but it was more than double the last bid. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide. The banker, Thompson, looked at me, his mouth agape. Blevins looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. The auctioneer found his voice. "I have 1,000 an acre. Do I hear 1,100? Silence. The investors shook their heads. The neighbors stepped back. "Going once," the auctioneer sang, his gaze fixed on me. "Going twice." He looked around one last time. "Sold. To Silas Miller for $80,000. The gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the quiet square. I walked forward through the parted crowd and signed the papers on the hood of the same banker's car where Blevins had signed his triumphant deal 6 years before. I wrote the check from my savings account, and the number didn't even make me flinch. It was the profit from the good years, money earned by my own sweat and my own caution. After the crowd had dispersed, and the bankers had packed up their briefcases, I walked over to where Blevins was still standing, numb. He wouldn't look at me. "Why?" he finally choked out, his voice thick. "Why would you do that? To gloat? To own the last piece of me?" "No, Richard," I said, my voice quiet. "That's not it at all." I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket. It was a simple rental agreement I'd had my lawyer draw up the day before, just in case. "I'm going to need someone to look after the place. Farm the ground for me. I'll rent it to you. 1/3 of the crop goes to me. The rest is yours. And you and your family can stay in the house, long as you need. No rent on the house." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears and confusion. I don't understand." "It's good land, Richard," I said. "It deserves to be farmed by a man who knows it. Your father's land. You're a good farmer. You just got caught in a bad storm." I held out the paper. "This isn't charity. It's a business arrangement. You'll earn your way back. It'll just be on a smaller scale. A scale a man can manage." He stared at the paper, then at my outstretched hand. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. His handshake was weak, but his grip was sincere. "Thank you, Silas," he whispered. "I won't forget this." The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis scoured the county, taking good men down with it. But it also taught a hard lesson. The ones who survived were the ones who were diversified, who were cautious, who understood the difference between credit and cash. The gospel of get big or get out was dead. The new gospel was stay in the game. Richard Blevins became my best tenant, and in time a good friend. He farmed that 80 acres like it was the most precious ground on earth. He learned to fix his own equipment, a smaller, older tractor he'd bought for cash. He came to my shop often, and I taught him how to weld, how to time an engine, how to make a part instead of buying one. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility and a deep, abiding respect for the land and the tools that worked it. 10 years later, he had saved up enough money to buy the 80 acres back from me, at the same price I had paid for it. The day we signed the papers was even better than the day I'd bought it. I got older. My hands, gnarled from a lifetime of work, weren't as steady as they used to be. My son David, who had gone off to college to study agriculture, came home to the farm. He had new ideas about soil conservation and crop rotation, ideas that worked well with my old philosophy of sustainability. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the shop with my grandson, Ben. He was about 10 years old, with a curious mind and hands that were already eager to learn. I was showing him how to use the lathe, turning a new bronze bushing for the axle on the old grain wagon. The air was thick with the smell of cutting oil and hot metal. "Grandpa," he asked, watching the brass shavings curl away from the cutter. "Dad said you used to have the oldest tractors in the whole county. Why didn't you ever buy a new one, like Mr. Blevins used to have?" I shut off the lathe and wiped my hands on a red rag. I looked around the shop, at the tools hanging on the walls, at the sturdy workbenches, at the old 4020 parked just outside the door, its green paint faded, but its engine ready to go. "Ben," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "There's a big difference between what something costs and what it's worth. Those new tractors, they cost a fortune, and they cost more than just money. They cost you your freedom. When you owe the bank for a machine like that, you don't own it. It owns you. Every decision you make, what to plant, when to sell, is made with the banker looking over your shoulder." I pointed to the lathe. "But this machine," I said, "and that welder over there, and that tractor out there, we own them. They don't send us a bill every month. When they break, we don't have to call a man in a truck and pay him $100 an hour. We fix them ourselves. That's real wealth. It's not about being big. It's about being independent." He looked at the bushing in my hand, then up at me, his young eyes trying to understand the weight of my words. I knew he didn't get all of it. Not yet. But he would. The lesson was in the steel, in the soil, in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that what you have is truly yours, paid for not just with money, but with sweat, with patience, and with the wisdom to know what is enough. The wind rattled the tin on the roof, the same steady sound I'd heard for 50 years, a sound of shelter and permanence. And I knew the farm was in good hands.